In this video I'm going to talk about fretboard visualization and my method and my kind of approach to learning the fingerboard, and it's specifically about how to learn notes in relation to a chord or a key that you're in and how I go about doing that. I've had a question on my scales video, what scales do I use? And the question was asking if I could go into a bit more depth, elaborate on how I go about, you know, visualizing everything and what shapes or anchor points that I use. So I'm going to talk about that, and I'd also like to talk about my kind of journey with it as well, kind of a little bit of the history of how I've gone about learning the fretboard since I was a young kid. So I'm going to divide this video into two parts. The first part will be the kind of history of my experience with it all, and then in the second part I'll give some more kind of, it'll be more focused on practical advice from a playing point of view. So if you've been following me online and stuff, you might be interested to know about my story with it all, but if you're literally just here just to, from a playing point of view, you just want to get some tips and things, then I'll put a timestamp in the description box below, and you can skip forward to where the playing kind of starts. But I'll start with my kind of history with everything. And so basically it goes back to when I was a little kid, and I'd learnt this shape, which is an E minor blues scale, and I knew that at the 12th fret everything happens again because of the octave, and so you could play the same thing here. And then basically when I was, I don't know the exact age, but I'm going to say between the age of like 9 and 11, I could have been 10 or 11, I could have been 9, can't quite remember, but I went to HMV, which is a music store in the UK, and we bought this, and this is Led Zeppelin, The Song Remains the Same. Now I was a big Led Zeppelin fan from a very young age, because my dad had the albums, and I'd been flicking through guitar magazines and looking at photos of Jimmy Page and Robert Plant and everybody. But it wasn't until this VHS, this is the very one, the exact one, it wasn't until this that I actually saw them play. And a little bit of a side note, but I remember when we got this, we were on our way to my dad's band practice, and we bought this in the shop. And at the band practice there was a video player with a television, and I was so eager to see it that I put it on, and the band were practicing in the same room, so I couldn't hear it, so I watched it on mute and just watched them play. You know, I was just so mesmerised by the band at the time, and still one of my favourite bands to this day. But anyway, one of the things I noticed in this video was Jimmy Page would be playing all over the fingerboard. And I remember thinking to myself, well, what's going on there, you know? Tunes like, you know, Whole Lot of Love and Dazed and Confused in particular, because they're both in the key of E. I could kind of jam along down here or jam along up here, but I didn't know what was going on in the middle of the fretboard, and Jimmy Page would be up and down. So my kind of, you know, 10-year-old brain, or whenever it was, I thought that perhaps he knew that where these notes were all throughout the fingerboard, not just in these two boxes. And I knew that if you tuned a guitar at the 5th fret, the notes repeated themselves every 5 frets and 4 frets for the B string. Also knew that this was an octave because of the 5 fret thing here. So what I did was I drew out a fingerboard on a piece of paper, probably about 15 frets, maybe 17 frets, I can't remember exactly. And I plotted out these notes, and I drew out these notes on the fretboard, and then I used this 5 fret thing and the octave thing that I knew, and I drew out all the other notes on the fingerboard right up the whole neck. And so I ended up with a piece of paper with a fretboard like that, with the whole E minor blues scale over the whole fretboard right up till like, yeah, the 15th or 17th fret. And I basically went about memorizing that. And the way I did that was I had the piece of paper in front of me, and I used to follow it with my eyes and play the notes with my fingers. So I'd go, you know, I'd just follow, and I wouldn't go necessarily in order. I'd jump around. And gradually I built up the whole picture in my head to the point where I could play any note in the E blues scale on the fretboard up and down, and I didn't know what any of these notes meant. I just knew the shape. And it wasn't until like later on that I realised that's not what Jimmy Page was doing at all, actually. But I mean, there might have been some of that involved, but he was, you know, mixing up majors and minors and lots of chromaticism as well. But you know, as a young kid, I was just trying to figure it out, and this is what one of the ideas I had. So anyway, that really helped, and I could play along, you know, in the key of E and jam along to some of my favourite riffs and stuff, like you know, I'd jam along to things like Oh Well, Peter Green and stuff like that. Anything in that key, Back in Black. So I could mess around in the key of E and have a good time, and I spent a long time doing that when I was a kid. So then a little while later, my dad came to me and said, apparently the Beatles used the C major scale. Maybe you should learn that one. And I think that came from this magazine. See, we learnt from magazines when I was a kid. Dad used to buy these magazines. Total Guitar, Guitar Techniques and Guitarist were the main ones. And we'd go down to the newsagents and have a look what songs were in that magazine and buy it and then go and learn from it. This one's got Stone Roses, Love Spreads and Fool's Gold. So this is probably where I learned about the Stone Roses, who are one of my favourite bands to this day. This came out in September 1999. I would have been 11 years old. But I'm not sure exactly when Dad told me, but it would perhaps around that time, 11, 12, something like that. But there's a feature in here about the Beatles songwriting special, and I've found it here. It says a quick theory lesson, and it goes into here. Take the basic diatonic major scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, spell C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and it talks about the major scale and creating chords within the major scale. So I think that's where Dad might have read about it, and I've still got this magazine because I remember seeing that and thinking, oh, that might be useful down the line. So I've kept it ever since. And basically, I thought, right, I'm going to do the same thing but with a C major scale. So I found a shape of the C major scale, a couple of boxes, and I plotted it all out over the fingerboard in exactly the same way, and I sat in front of it and I memorised it in exactly the same way. Again, I didn't know what any of these notes meant, I just knew the shape, and it meant I could play anywhere on the fingerboard in the key of C, and play notes in the C major scale. And then, probably around a similar time, I'd bought this book. This is a scales book, and I was obviously thinking at the time I should know more scales. And I opened it up to C major, and it says C major Ionian. And I wasn't sure what Ionian meant, but I could see that this shape, and the reason I bought this book is because they had the tab for the individual positions, but at the bottom it had the diagrams over the whole fingerboards, and that's how I'd been learning. So I was like, well, this is the scale book for me, because it'll be, you know, I can continue learning in the same fashion. And C Ionian, and I was like, right, I recognise that. I see all the same shapes, I know that. Okay, and then I went to the next page, C natural minor, Aeolian, and I started going, wow, I've got to learn all of these scales. And so I started learning this one, and I realised that it's the same shape, but just 3 frets away. So the C natural minor Aeolian is actually the E flat major scale. And once I realised the shapes were the same, they were just shifted like a conveyor belt, I went to the next page, C Dorian, and then I realised that's the same, but that's a tone away. And then C Phrygian, and I realised that all these shapes, virtually all the shapes in the whole book, are the same, but they've just moved on the fretboard like a conveyor belt. There were a few in there I didn't that weren't the same. For example, the whole tone, diminished stuff, and a few of the harmonic minor, etc., etc. But Dorian, Phrygian, Mixed Lydian, Locrian, I'd inadvertently learnt all of these because of the way I learnt that first scale. And I didn't know what modes were at the time, but I just saw these words and just thought they were the names of the scales. I didn't learn about modes until later on. But anyway, that's how I learnt the fretboard. That's how I first memorised the fretboard, and that gave me a really useful starting point for when I eventually did come to learn what these notes were, what they meant, how to create chords out of them and stuff like that. But back then, when I was a kid, I had no idea about any of that. I just memorised shapes thinking it would be useful to me. So that was the kind of early part of my learning of the notes on the fretboard and learning kind of shapes that would become useful to me down the line. And it wasn't until a few years later, when I was a teenager, I was working as a Saturday boy in a guitar shop in a place called Lempster, Trevor Davis music, and my boss, Trevor Davis, he plays jazz guitar. And when the shop was empty, occasionally he would sit down with me. I'd go and make some coffee and we'd sit down and talk about guitar. And he would show me a few things on the guitar, and he would show me a few chords that I didn't know. And he actually was the one who explained to me about how to create chords from scales using the 1, 3, 5, etc. and chords within scales like 2, 5, 1, what a 2, 5, 1 was. And I remember him once saying to me, you know about modes? And I was like, not really sure. And he explained the modes to me, and I was like, I already know all this. I know all these shapes because of that initial big major scale shape that I'd learnt. So all the different modes, the shapes that you'd use for the different modes, I already had them under my fingers and in my memory. I just didn't know what they were and how they were useful. And Trevor really helped me learn how they can be useful and how they are used. Not long after that is when I really started getting interested in theory, and then eventually going on a journey learning jazz guitar. Okay, so let's now talk about some actual practical information that might be useful to you as a player. The first way I went about learning notes in relation to their root key was to take a basic C major shape that fitted around this chord. This is how I did it. That's obviously a familiar shape to me, so I picked this kind of C major box, if you will. that's the first kind of C major shape very often that you'll find if you Google C major shape. And what I did was I applied numbers to these notes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. Now obviously in the second octave the 2 can be a 9, the 11 is a 4, the 6 can be a 13, etc, etc. Usually the third remains as a third, even though it is a 10th as well. And the 5 is usually stays as a 5. But anyway, I used to just call out, I used to pick 2 or 3 numbers and then I'd try and play them. So I'd go 1, 3, 5, and I'd try it in the next octave, like that, 3, 4, 5, etc. You know, 7, 5, 6. And then gradually I'd be kind of relating all of this to this chord shape. So I'd be like, you know, here's the third, and then 5, and here's the 6, or 13. Major 7 will be here. And I'd be playing these notes and visualising that chord shape. And then I'd expand out of this initial box, and I'd say, right, 1, 3, 5. You could also play 1, 3, 5 here, and here, and here, and here, and then gradually expand. Here it is here. Now this is based around this kind of shape here, kind of almost like an open A chord. And try and play these 3 notes anywhere on the fingerboard. And obviously that's just the 1, 3, 5, but let's try it, you know, 6, 5, 3. 6, 5, 3, 6, 5, 3, etc, etc. And I would do that all over, and I'd just kind of sit there just experimenting. I didn't have a strict method with this. I would just be like, I'd sit in front of the telly and do it. Then I'd start adding sharps and flats. So then we'd go 6, flat 6, flat 13, sharp 5, same note, 5. And then expand on that, you know, minor third, flat 5, 6, minor third, like that, maybe all on one string, maybe in different shapes and things like that. Gradually I'd be creating a picture of the fingerboard so that you can jump around and play different intervals and know what they are basically, and not just be kind of, you know, not kind of stabbing in the dark. And that's basically how I picture the fingerboard. Is all these notes relate to a root key. Now you've got this shape here. You can use chord shapes to help you visualise this, as I was saying. You've got this shape, that's the one I started with, but then of course you've got, there's a C shape there, there's a C shape here. Now I usually picture everything based on roots on the lowest 2 strings, okay? So this one here is rooted on the low string. This one here is rooted on the low string. This one here is rooted on the A string, and this one here is rooted on the A string. Now, linked to these shapes is the upper octave. If I take that shape there and I go up an octave, I end up here, which is like a D shape, that kind of shape, but up here. But I kind of picture that D kind of open D shape as an extension of this, because to me they're kind of linked. Likewise, you've got this shape here, which is your kind of open A chord. The second octave is here, or so that's so most of what I do when I'm visualizing a chord and its notes in relation to the root chord, I'm kind of picturing around these shapes. Now this might be a little linked to the cage system. I've never studied the cage system, at least consciously, but from what I understand, you take the open chord shapes and you apply them in a way that I think so that you don't have to move positions. So you can be like, I could be wrong here, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below, but from what I understand, the brief times I have looked at it, you can play like C here, and you can play like an A flat there, you play an E flat there, you play D there, you can play an E there, you can play basically any chord without moving too far away from one position. That might be really, really useful if you're reading, for example, where you can't keep looking at your fingerboard. But when I play, I like to be able to jump around. I like a lot of my shapes go up and down the fingerboard rather than down in a box, in a position, a fixed position. So that's how I basically visualize it. I take kind of root chords and I build from there. And you can sit around playing notes, try and find the same thing all over the fingerboard and relate it to each kind of chord shape. Another trick which I like is actually, I know initially I learnt it going this way, but I actually prefer, generally I prefer shapes that repeat going that way. So the reason I like this is because very often the shape, if you want to play the same line in 3 different octaves, the shape will be the same or very similar. It only shifts when there's the B string G string relationship. But if you're doing that in a box here, you want to go 1 3 5. Well, here 1 3 5 is a different shape, so that makes it a little more complicated. Whereas if you go here and then shift to here and then shift to here, it's the same shape 3 times. So you can go. Whereas if you wanted to play, that lick, but within this box, you've got to kind of go. You've kind of got to play a different pattern, and that's less useful to me because I like things that I can repeat in different octaves, and that just makes much more sense to me. So learning shapes that repeat themselves is very useful, and learning everything with note relationships is very useful. Knowing what they are, what all the notes are, rather than just learning something as a pattern, that's way less useful to you in the long run. It might be a bit of a drag at first to kind of take these lines that you know already and then just try and apply what numbers they are. But I think in the long run it'll definitely benefit you knowing this stuff, and it also makes it easier to change keys and things like that. So so that's basically how I do it, and then of course obviously you shift into different keys, you're using minors, majors, stuff, dominant chords, but the process is the same. It's about knowing where all the notes are in relation to root notes, and for me I usually pick the root notes on the low 2 strings. Anyway, so hopefully that sheds some light on the whole thing, maybe helps a few people out. This video is a lot longer than I'd originally hoped, but hopefully I'm not, rambling on too much. But maybe you find it's useful. But feel free to ask me some questions below. I'm happy to keep talking about topics like this. It's something I'm really interested in. So yeah, cheers. See you in the next one.